this is Reverend Don Lewis, coming to you from the beautiful metaverse. And this is Reverend Don's Vlog. Thank you for joining me. I was going to do a live stream with Ravenwolf Greenfield on Friday, but that fell through because his father had to go to the hospital. So I didn't do a vlog on Friday because I usually only do one video appearance in a day, unless it's a very unusual day. But I'm back now, and we have a question today from Mike C. Now, because today is Valentine's Day, you might think that I would do a vlog on the subject of Lupercalia, but that would be rather predictable, and besides, I've done that before. Instead, we're just going to do a regular vlog. And Mike C. asked our last question on the subject of physical immortality, and he has a follow-up. And his comment is as follows. Excellent answers as always. Thank you, Mike. I do wonder, connected to what you are saying here, even about the ancient Egyptian burials which have been disturbed, would that be messing up their plans for the afterlife at all? On the other hand, it's a good thing that the remains are being protected rather than ransacked. However, on the other hand, the occupants' wishes were that they remain in their tomb. It's an interesting notion on balancing archaeology with respect for a human's afterlife wishes, and that's certainly true. So what do I say to this? And there's so much I could say to this, and so many different things I'd like to include in this vlog, and I don't know that I'm going to get to all of them because it's a short format. But I think I want to start with whether or not opening an ancient tomb in some way disturbs the spirit whose body is connected with that tomb. And I can only go so far with this because it could in fact go very far and could be a whole book unto itself, but this is not that large a format. And I want to say hello to Sheila St. Pierre. Hello, Sheila. Thank you for joining us. So what I would say is that the first consideration in this question is the individual whose tomb is being discussed. And hello to Noreen Sullivan. Thank you for joining us. Not everyone has the same considerations, and not all times and places have the same considerations. For example, a contemporary American living in this century, I don't think would be very connected to their gravesite. There are exceptions, particularly from certain backgrounds, but I think most people, while they might possibly have some connection in a short term, would not be connected very long. It's not how we interact with spirits. And hello to Mary Hawk. Thank you for joining us. When you don't put a lot of importance on the tomb in the lifetime, it doesn't stand to reason you're going to put much importance on it in the afterlife. But not all cultures have been this way, and not even everyone today, as I come from a family that did put some importance on the tomb. I imagine I will when I have crossed over, simply because it's the background I come from. But I don't imagine I'll still be worrying about it 1,000 years from now, so to speak. I think the main reason why you see spirits connected to their tombs in the first place is not because the body is there, but because the living who the spirit has a connection to use the tomb as an interface to speak to the spirit. Ancestrally, this was where offerings were often made. Even within the Christian religion, up until quite recently, pilgrimages to the tomb of your various ancestors were quite common, and in some parts of the Christian world even today. So it's not even just a pagan thing. And as long as that's going on, I think the spirit will have a connection to the tomb. As long as the descendants continue to honor them there, I think they will have a connection to the tomb, and maybe somewhat beyond. If that's not the custom of their culture, I think they'll have a lot less connection. You know, many people today don't even have tombs. They have their ashes scattered. Obviously, there's nothing even to disturb there. And that spirit will not be connected to that little bit of ash floating in the wind somewhere. But if the family has an ancestor altar, the fact that the body has been cremated and dispersed will not stop that spirit from being connected to the ancestor altar, to their descendants and those who are still interacting with them. Now, as a Corellian, I'm also a reincarnationalist. I believe both in the ancestors and in reincarnation. And you say, well, how can you believe that? And I've had that question on the vlog. And the answer actually brings us back to the ancient Egyptians. And I want to say hello to Shannon Bruce. Thank you for joining us, Shannon. If you look at the ancient Egyptians, they believed the soul had many different aspects. Some of those aspects went on to dwell among the gods. Some went to a kind of afterworld paradise. Some went to the tomb, where they remained at the Ka chapel to interact with the living, and various other fates of parts of the soul that were aspects. And when you read about this in most books, it's been interpreted by people from a Christian background who are used to thinking of the soul as just being their consciousness. The idea that it would have aspects beyond this is hard for them to wrap themselves around. And so the view you get, in my opinion, is rather naive, but very similar to many modern pagan ideas about the soul. For example, we talk about the higher self, the lower self, the soul, the astral self. We are very much familiar with the idea of a soul of many aspects. One of these aspects, part of the higher self, will become an ancestor. Other parts of the soul will be reincarnated. Other parts of the soul may be reincarnated right now. It's not just necessarily one incarnation at a time, because the soul is more complex than we are. And I've done other vlogs going into greater detail on that. I'm not going to go into great detail at this moment, except to say that the soul is complex and it has many aspects. And one of those aspects will stay connected to mortuary chapels, if those are being used, particularly in a given culture. But just as the ancient Egyptians said, when that practice stops, that aspect will fade away. I don't think it ceases to exist. I think it becomes dormant within the greater soul. And my thought on archaeological opening of tombs, based in part on what we are told from traditional stories about disquieted spirits, is that the soul will tend to be connected as long as it is remembered, or maybe about 300 years at most. Beyond that, you don't really hear about a lot of spirits who are upset if something happens to their grave, because the vast majority of graves from any earlier than that, and often later, have been disturbed. All of those charnel houses in Europe, where you have all those bones arranged in artistic styles, well, they were once in graves, but they were dug up and moved. And you never hear about those spirits being upset about that. They have moved on. You hear very rarely about any spirit from more than a few hundred years ago in any context whatsoever. There are a few exceptions, but they're very few indeed. The oldest one I have heard of was connected to an artifact that was about, I believe, 5,000 years old. It came up in an interview that we did with the Wheel of Hecate magazine 30 years ago. Somewhere it's in writing, but at any rate, there was an archaeological relic that had a disquieted spirit connected to it, who was upset with how the relic was being displayed. And the person who was working with this case, the person they brought in, very much below the radar because they didn't want to be seen to be doing this, but they found that the spirit needed to be near another artifact that they were found with. They were put together. There was no more problem. I believe the artifact was a knife. It may have been the weapon that killed this person, but they did not, for whatever reason, want to be parted from it. And the issue stopped after that. But that's the farthest one back I have heard of. Now, if you've heard of one farther back, please feel free to share. I would love to know. But for the most part, you don't hear about spirits that old. And if we look at Egypt specifically, because that's what Mike was asking about, we don't see it. Where are the stories of ancient Egyptian spirits running around, ancient or modern? Well, if you go back more than a couple of thousand years, there were some stories, but not more recently than that. You don't hear about the ghost of Nefertiti haunting the Cairo Museum, for example. You do hear about King Tutankhamun's curse, which you hear a lot of things about it. That could be a show in itself, but that's a curse, not a spirit. And of course, the difference between a ghost and a spirit, these really would be more ghosts. And hello to Cheryl May Ackerstrom. Thank you for joining us, and happy Valentine's Day to you. I'll just happy Lupercalia as well. A ghost is caught. A spirit is present by choice. So when ancient Egyptians were making offerings in the Ka chapels, it was to the spirits of their ancestors. These were not ghosts. They came of their own free will to interact with the living. And as I say, the actual Egyptian belief was when those offerings stopped, that spirit would fade away, for want of a better way to put it. That they often described it as starving to death. But I would say they would fade away into the greater part of the soul. Therefore, they're not going to be upset all these centuries later when they're no longer engaged, that tomb is opened. But even if they were, all but a very, very few Egyptian tombs were already opened centuries ago. It's a very rare tomb that is undisturbed. So if they were going to be upset, they were upset then. We're just rediscovering what's already mostly been ransacked. I was reading the other day that there are some people who believe they've found Ankhesenamun's coffin, the wife of Tutankhamun. But there's no body associated with it because it was ransacked millennia ago. I don't know that I believe this is her coffin because it seems awfully simple for a person of that status. But on the other hand, the gold plating could have been removed. It could have been a grander coffin originally. But again, her tomb was destroyed long ago. So the fact that people are exhibiting her coffin is not going to bother her under any circumstances, I wouldn't think, because anything that was going to bother her already did. But add to that, the few undisturbed tombs that have been discovered, there are no stories of hauntings connected to them. And a couple of things about the ancient Egyptians. We talked about how their understanding of the soul is based on the idea of aspects that can be quite different, much as our modern pagan understanding also takes these into account. Their treatment of the tomb is not necessarily what you might think it is based on what you have read from Wallace Budge. Writing more than 100 years ago, the Egyptians actually regularly reopened their tombs. Once it was sealed, it wasn't necessarily sealed forever. Usually it was within the family. More people might be added. Grave goods might be added or removed because we see people reusing grave goods from previous burials. So obviously they did not believe, if they had that practice, that those things had to stay there forever in order for the deceased to have them in the afterlife, which was the point of putting them in. The Egyptians are the origin of the idea of the astral plane. It goes back to them, at least as far as written records would say, and they believed that they were recreating these items in the astral for the deceased. But the fact that they were willing to remove them from the tomb later suggests that once that was done, they didn't feel it was that important for the physical object to remain. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been doing that. And, it used to be thought when they found that a coffin belonging to one person had been reused for another, that it must have been a spare. But it's not necessarily looked at that way now. For example, Tutankhamun's coffins were not all made for him. Some of them were made for what might have been his brother or cousin. And it could be that they were removed from that cousin's tomb or brother's tomb when Tutankhamun died unexpectedly young. I think the idea is that family members wouldn't have objected to their being reused. But if this is the case, then the idea that these tombs were to be undisturbed for eternity is simply not true. They obviously did reopen them, though I'm sure they did with great ceremony and great respect. But we have assumptions that aren't necessarily true here. Um, so I don't know if they'd be all that upset even if they were still spiritually connected to that tomb. Um, because what they needed from it, they already have in the astral. If in fact that aspect of their soul has remained distinct. I rather think they would mostly be dormant, particularly having been forgotten for millennia, as they were for the most part. Now, that brings me to the last thing I want to comment on, which is if you wonder how the ancient Egyptians would have felt about their tombs being opened, being remembered was extremely important to these people. It was a very important part of their culture and their religion. And I think that they would have been delighted to be remembered anew. Most of these people were forgotten. Tutankhamun was unknown to history. Ankhesenamun, unknown to history. Akhenaten himself, who was very important in Egyptian history, was also totally forgotten for thousands of years. Some of them were remembered, but not much was remembered about them. And I think, if anything, they would probably be rather happy to have their posterity restored, to be brought back to consciousness among people. And I think this might have a reactivating effect on that part of the soul that was these people, or it might not. And the only way to know that is through experience. And as I say, people aren't having those experiences. People aren't encountering angry Egyptian spirits who are upset their tomb was opened. If they were upset, I think you would. They're not even encountering angry spirits who are upset their tombs were disturbed within the last 100 years, for the most part. There are, of course, many examples of spirits who are upset that their tomb was disturbed within the last few hundred years, but they're far fewer than the number of people who were buried in that time period or otherwise entombed. So I don't know that it's as big an issue to the spirit as some people would like to think it is. And I certainly don't think that it disturbs what Mike has called the afterlife planes. If anything, in the case of the Egyptians, I think it would reinforce or reinvigorate that aspect of the soul, rather than in any way taking away from it. The fact that these names are now spoken again, despite the fact that we can't possibly be pronouncing them correctly, but we know who they are, I think would fill them with great happiness rather than the opposite, because this was important to them in life. And I think more important than that physical tomb, which has been neglected all these centuries anyway, because the importance of the tomb was the tomb offerings that have not been being made for a very long time. The existence of the spirit was in what we would call the astral, in a number of different aspects. So these are my thoughts. I hope you find them interesting. If you like the vlog, please hit like, subscribe, or share according to where you're seeing it. And I want to say hello to Scott Andrew Morris, who makes the comment that the last death is being forgotten, being remembered is the challenge. And I think that's exactly the point. And for the Egyptians, I think they would be thrilled that they are again remembered. So these are my thoughts. I hope you find them interesting. And until next time, may you blessed be.